I didn't notice the envelope until later that night, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the dishwasher hummed softly in the background. It was tucked under the edge of the fruit bowl, almost deliberately hidden, as if it had been placed there for me to find only by accident. I picked it up with damp fingers, expecting a bill or maybe a card, something with handwriting, something that felt like it belonged to me. But the envelope was unmarked, no name, no sentiment, just a thin piece of cardstock and a printed itinerary folded inside. The spa's name was printed in gold script at the top of the page. Beneath it, the words 7-Day Restorative Retreat stood out like a dare. The date and time were already confirmed. A room had been booked, meals included, services pre-selected. It had all been handled, every detail paid for, every preference assumed. There was no handwritten note, no "I thought you needed this," no "happy anniversary," just a transaction made on my behalf by a man who hadn't looked me in the eyes for weeks. I stood there for a long time holding that paper, the corners softening from the moisture on my skin. There was no mistake. It was for me. It was his version of a gift. After 20 years, this was what thoughtfulness had been reduced to. A prearranged vacation booked without conversation, without affection, without effort. A quiet message delivered not with love, but with avoidance. I wanted to be grateful. I told myself I should be grateful, but all I felt was empty. The next morning, I packed in silence. Just a carry-on, enough for 7 days. I folded soft clothes I hadn't worn in years, things that made me feel like someone else. There was no goodbye. He left before I did, as usual, the sound of the garage door closing barely acknowledged. I stood in the middle of our bedroom with my bag in hand, staring at the spot where he'd slept. The sheets were still warm, and I hated that I noticed. The drive to the retreat was uneventful. 2 hours of smooth roads, overcast skies, and the occasional burst of sunlight slipping between clouds. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want company, even artificial. My thoughts were loud enough. The closer I got to the resort, the more I felt something tighten inside me. Not nerves exactly, but something heavier, like dread wrapped in silk. I hadn't taken time for myself in years, not real time, and I wasn't sure what I would find waiting in all that quiet. When I pulled into the gravel drive, the first thing I noticed was how perfect everything looked. The hedges were sculpted, the air smelled like rosemary and damp stone, and soft instrumental music played from somewhere invisible. The lobby was dimly lit, all polished wood and hushed voices. A woman in beige greeted me with a smile so smooth it felt like part of her uniform. She handed me a welcome packet and explained my schedule. Daily massages, facials, meditation at sunrise. Every hour already claimed, every breath choreographed. My room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the lake. It was beautiful in the kind of way that made me feel out of place. Too clean, too intentional. The bed was turned down with a chocolate on the pillow. A white robe hung neatly on the bathroom door. Everything smelled like lavender and citrus. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the glass doors leading to the balcony. Outside, the lake barely moved. It was still, too still. I unpacked slowly, touching each item of clothing like it belonged to someone else. I didn't know who I was in this place. Without the noise of my home, the weight of responsibility, the constant pull of obligation, I felt disoriented, like a shell of something that had once been full. I looked at the itinerary again, tracing the schedule with my finger. A massage, first thing in the morning, some kind of custom treatment. No name listed for the therapist, just a time, a room, a ritual to begin the unraveling. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sheets were too crisp, the silence too complete. I kept listening for familiar sounds, the creak of our hallway, the hum of our refrigerator, the soft sigh of him rolling over beside me. But there was nothing, just my own breath and the faint rustle of leaves outside. I turned onto my side and stared at the empty half of the bed. For the first time in a long time, I realized how much space I had and how little of it felt mine. The clock blinked past midnight when I finally closed my eyes. I tried not to think about what he was doing. If he missed me, if he cared, if this trip was his way of apologizing or his way of buying silence. I told myself it didn't matter, that I would let the spa do its job, that I would come back different, better, lighter. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I knew I wasn't there to relax. I was there because I had nowhere else to go. The hallway to the treatment rooms was dim and quiet, lined with smooth stones and low lighting that cast long golden shadows across the floor. I walked slowly, almost cautiously, following the receptionist's gentle instructions. Room 9, the last door on the left. My bare feet barely made a sound on the heated tiles, but my pulse echoed loudly in my ears. I could hear faint music behind the door, something with no melody, just soft, floating tones like mist curling over water. I paused before entering, hand resting on the handle longer than necessary, unsure why I hesitated. Inside, the room was warmer than the hallway, heavy with the scent of eucalyptus and sandalwood. Candles flickered from recessed shelves, casting soft light across the space. The massage table stood at the center, covered in clean white sheets and a rolled towel at the headrest. A small bowl of warm oil sat on a side table, steam rising from its surface. I noticed all of this in passing, distracted by the quiet movement in the corner. The therapist had her back to me, tying her hair into a loose bun, her figure outlined by the candlelight. She turned and offered a polite nod. I nodded back, not trusting my voice. She gestured to the table. I slipped out of my robe and folded it neatly, placing it on the bench. The air kissed my skin, cool against the warmth of the room. I lay down slowly, face pressed into the cradle, arms resting at my sides. The sheet was pulled gently over me, covering my body in a way that felt ceremonial, almost reverent. I heard her moving, the sound of her hands smoothing oil, the soft pat of bare feet against the floor. And then I felt her. Her hands were warm, not just from the oil, but from her. They settled on my shoulders first, palms flat, firm, but not forceful. The first few strokes were exploratory, tracing the shape of my upper back, mapping me like unfamiliar terrain. I exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. There was no rush in her movements. She worked in long, slow circles, her thumbs kneading into tension I didn't know I was carrying. The pressure shifted down my spine, rhythmic and intentional, unlocking muscles with a patience that felt personal. Her fingers moved like they had time, as if I were the only appointment that mattered. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Her silence allowed my thoughts to drift, dislodge, scatter into nothing. I felt myself sinking, inch by inch, into something that wasn't sleep, but something close to it. A floating awareness, detached and warm. When her hands reached the small of my back, something shifted. There was a slowness, a pause between movements that made my skin more sensitive, more aware. She continued lower, working along the sides of my waist, fingertips brushing close to places the sheet was meant to protect. My breath caught slightly, but I didn't tense. I didn't stop her. Her touch wasn't aggressive. It was curious, methodical, and deeply, unnervingly gentle. She adjusted the sheet, exposing one leg, tucking the fabric carefully to preserve modesty even as her hands moved along my thigh. The oil was warm, her grip firmer now, working along the muscles with practiced precision. But every now and then, her fingers would trail just a little slower than expected. Not inappropriate, not overt, but undeniable. I kept my eyes closed and focused on the heat pooling deep in my stomach. When she moved to the other side, the same pattern continued. Smooth, structured strokes, interrupted by brief moments of softness that lingered a second too long. I began to anticipate them, count the seconds between them, feel the absence when they didn't come. My skin felt hypersensitive, tuned entirely to her rhythm. The scent of her oil, the sound of her breathing, the occasional graze of her arm against mine, they all began to blur together into something heady and unfamiliar. She returned to my back, this time with smaller movements. Her fingers traced along my ribs, the sides of my torso, inching higher with careful, feather-light pressure. I could feel her breath near my ear as she leaned in, adjusting her stance, repositioning her hands. My neck tilted instinctively as she began to work the muscles there, her thumbs pressing delicately behind my jaw. A shiver ran through me, not from cold, but from something else entirely. There was no way she didn't notice. My body was reacting to her, my breathing, my flushed skin, the slight movements I made without meaning to. But she didn't pause. She continued with the same slow intensity, never crossing a clear line, but always skimming close enough that my body felt electrified. I didn't know whether to be embarrassed or grateful. I only knew that I didn't want it to stop. As the session neared its end, her hands returned to my shoulders. She applied pressure with her palms, easing me back down, grounding me. I felt her thumbs press into the base of my skull, and something inside me exhaled. My limbs were heavy, my thoughts slowed to a crawl. When she finished, she pulled the sheet gently over me, tucking it around my sides like a blanket. She stepped away, her presence retreating slowly from the room, leaving behind only the lingering imprint of her hands. I lay still for a long time, unsure what had just happened. It had been a massage, technically, but also something else, something more intimate than touch, but quieter than desire. My skin still hummed from her, as if her hands had left traces of heat beneath the surface. When I finally sat up, the air felt different. The room was quiet, the candles had burned lower, and my robe sat exactly where I left it. I dressed slowly, feeling like my body no longer fit quite the same. There was a flush in my cheeks I couldn't explain, and my hands trembled slightly as I tied the robe. Outside, the hallway was still empty. The same soft music played overhead, but everything felt changed. Or maybe it was just me. I returned to my room, crawled into bed, and pulled the blanket tight around my body. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time I shifted, I felt her. The memory of her hand stayed with me, warm and quiet, like a secret written on skin. The next morning, I lingered in bed longer than I meant to. The sheets were still warm from my body, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else's heat had lingered there too. My skin still held the memory of touch, soft, careful, almost reverent. I moved slowly, unsure if it was because of soreness or hesitation. Every stretch, every shift in my limbs reminded me of the way her hands had moved over me. It wasn't pain I felt, it was awareness, thick and unsettling. I dressed without urgency, pulling on clothes that felt too coarse against a body that had grown used to softness. I didn't want breakfast. I didn't want company. I just wanted quiet, but not the kind that filled my room like fog. I wanted the kind of quiet that came with her presence, wordless, focused, dense with something I couldn't name. I found myself looking at the clock more than once, counting down the hours until I could return to that room. It wasn't restlessness, it was hunger. Around noon, I went to the front desk. I pretended it was casual.
I asked if any appointments had opened up. The receptionist smiled too brightly and tapped at her keyboard. She told me it was unusual for a guest to request the same therapist twice in one stay. I nodded politely, but inside I felt exposed. I tried to mask the heat rising to my cheeks. When she confirmed the booking, same room, same time, I exhaled in a way I hadn't realized I was holding in. My name was back on her schedule. That was all that mattered. The rest of the day moved in slow motion. I wandered the grounds, pretending to admire the gardens and listen to the fountain's gentle bubbling. I sat by the lake and watched the wind ripple across the surface like something was trying to break through. But my thoughts always returned to her, her hands, her breath, the space she created with her silence. I replayed yesterday's session like a film, pausing on the moments where she lingered just a second too long or touched a little too gently. It wasn't imagined. It couldn't have been. My body wouldn't have reacted like that if it weren't real. By the time I stepped back into the treatment room, my heart was already racing. The scent hadn't changed, eucalyptus and something warmer, maybe cinnamon. The lights were still low, the candles still flickering in quiet rhythm. She was already there, her expression calm, unreadable. She nodded once, just like before, and I nodded back. There was no small talk, no hesitation. It felt like continuation, not repetition. I undressed with more intention this time. There was no nervousness, no second guessing. I placed the robe carefully on the bench and lay down, adjusting myself so the sheet barely covered me. I didn't know what I was inviting, only that I wanted to be noticed. My skin tingled in anticipation. Every nerve felt attuned to the weight of air around me. She approached with the same slow steps, the same deliberate silence. But this time, I felt her presence differently, closer, more intimate, as if the distance between us had already narrowed. Her hands started at my shoulders again, but the pressure was deeper, more confident. She worked slowly, drawing long lines down my back, warming my muscles before pressing into them. I felt myself melt beneath her touch, my breath slowing, my spine softening. When she reached the base of my back, she paused, just long enough for the stillness to become charged. Then she continued, letting her hands drift to the sides of my waist, her thumbs brushing over the soft flesh just above my hips. My body responded with quiet tremors I couldn't control. She adjusted the sheet more delicately this time, exposing one leg completely. Her fingers traced from my ankle to my thigh, massaging muscle with skilled precision, but with a tenderness that felt like exploration. I didn't move, I didn't speak, but inside something burned, quiet, steady, patient. Her touch avoided anything explicit, but it hovered around the edges of intimacy, skating along boundaries we both pretended not to see. When she reached the inner part of my thigh, her hand slowed, pressing deeper, holding longer. My breath hitched. She didn't pause. I felt her shift to the other side. My eyes were closed, but I imagined her watching me, studying the way I reacted to her. Her hands were oil-slicked and warm, her palms gliding over my skin with a certainty that made me ache. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. My body had already answered. Each touch built on the last, drawing a map she clearly knew by heart. And still, she never crossed the line. She just walked it, step by excruciating step, like a tightrope with no safety net. Her hands moved to my lower back again, pressing in slow circles, anchoring me. She leaned in slightly, her breath brushing against the top of my shoulder. I wanted to turn my head, to see her expression, to understand what she saw when she looked at me like this. But I stayed still, letting her do what she came to do. Or maybe what I had come back for. The lines between intention and instinct had already blurred. The session ended the same way it had before. Her touch softened, her movements slowed, her presence retreated. She adjusted the sheet with gentle care, covering me as if she hadn't just peeled something open inside me. I lay there long after she stepped away, my eyes still closed, my body humming. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to return to the world outside that door. In that room with her, I felt something close to weightlessness. When I finally stood, I moved carefully, as if any sudden motion might break the spell. My legs were unsteady, not from fatigue, but from something deeper, something undone. I dressed in silence, folded my robe with trembling fingers, and glanced once toward her as I left. She didn't meet my eyes. She didn't need to. Whatever had passed between us didn't live in glances. It lived in sensation, in the space between skin and thought, in the breath that caught when her hand lingered just a second too long. And I knew I would come back again. I didn't book the 4th session through the front desk. I didn't have to. As I passed by the counter that morning, the receptionist gave me a smile that felt heavier than it had a few days ago. There was something knowing in her eyes, something too smooth in the way she slid a new appointment card across the counter. My name was already on it, the same time, the same room. My throat tightened as I slipped the card into my pocket without speaking. I wondered if I'd crossed into some unspoken category, one where rules shifted and silence was expected. All day, I waited with a strange electricity in my chest. I tried to distract myself with the resort's empty luxuries, tea rituals, sunlit yoga, fruit platters arranged like art, but my body moved through everything like it was made of something foreign. My skin didn't belong to me. My mouth felt dry, my thoughts too loud. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even excited. I was simply waiting for something I didn't understand but couldn't turn away from. The room hadn't changed. The same shadows along the walls. The same faint hum of ambient music. She was already there when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us moved. There was no small talk, no polite nod. I undressed slowly, deliberately, letting the robe slide from my shoulders without the pretense of modesty. She watched me with the same expression she always wore, calm, focused, unreadable. But something in the air felt different. The air felt heavier, like the moment before thunder breaks. I lay on the table without covering myself. The sheet remained folded at the end, untouched. She approached with bare feet and oil-warmed hands, but this time there was no prelude, no easing in. Her palms met my skin with a firmness that felt like a decision. She touched me like she had already been there, like the map of my body had been etched in her memory. Every movement was confident, unapologetic. I arched beneath her almost involuntarily, not from surprise, but from recognition. Her hands moved down my spine with slow, heavy pressure, each stroke lower, deeper. There was no boundary anymore. Her fingers slid over the curves of my hips, pressed into the tops of my thighs, grazed between them without hesitation. I didn't flinch. I didn't question. I opened for her. My legs drifted apart naturally, as if pulled by some invisible tide. She didn't ask. She didn't pause. Her hands moved as if they were answering a need that had been written into me long before this moment. Her mouth followed the path of her hands, soft at first, almost hesitant, as if testing what came next. But when I didn't stop her, when I shifted to give her more, she deepened. Her lips traced the backs of my knees, the inside of my thighs, the crease where heat had started to gather. She kissed me there, once, like a promise, and then lowered her mouth further. I gasped, one arm reaching over my head, the other gripping the edge of the table. Her tongue was slow, certain. Every flick, every press, every breath against me was a revelation. I came too quickly, without warning. My body pulsed against her mouth, hips rising, back arching. She didn't stop. She kept going, drawing me out, coaxing every last tremor from my muscles until I collapsed into the table like liquid. My skin was damp, my heart beat loud. The air in the room shimmered with heat and salt and something dangerously close to gratitude. I turned my head to the side and closed my eyes, not to rest, but to make sense of what I had just given her.
She didn't speak. She didn't touch me again. She simply stepped away, disappearing into the shadows of the room while I lay there, limbs heavy, body open. I waited for her return, for a towel, a hand, a word, but nothing came. Minutes passed. I sat up slowly, wrapping the sheet around me as if modesty could return after what had just happened. She was gone. The door was slightly ajar. The only trace of her was the faint indentation on the floor where her feet had been. Back in my room, I showered for too long. The water beat down on my skin like punishment, but nothing washed away the feeling of her. I dried off and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked the same, but something had shifted. I was undone in a way that couldn't be seen, only felt. Something had been given and taken in the same moment, and I wasn't sure what I was left with. I pressed my palm to my chest and felt my own heartbeat, as if it belonged to someone else. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the lights off, staring into the dark, listening to the silence. My body buzzed with memory, not just of touch, but of exposure. I had offered her something more than flesh, and she had taken it without a word. No promise, no softness, just an unspoken ending, a quiet extraction. I wondered if that had been the point all along, if I had simply stepped into a ritual that others before me had walked through, barefoot and unknowing, thinking it was meant only for them. And maybe that was the most intimate thing of all, the absence that followed. The silence that felt louder than her breath ever had. The knowing that what happened wasn't connection, it was closure, wrapped in warmth and sweat and candlelight. A final touch with no return, a gift without a card, a finale I didn't recognize until it had already passed. I avoided the massage building for a full day. I wandered through the gardens, walked barefoot along the lake's edge, and sat in the sauna longer than anyone should. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to that room, to the scent of her skin mixed with the oil, to the heat of her mouth, to the way I had opened for her, like a door that had always been unlocked but never tried. I tried to convince myself it had been a mistake, or a dream, or some strange boundary crossed in a place where the real world didn't apply. But my body wouldn't let me forget. Neither would my silence. On the second morning, I went to the front desk with the excuse of asking about my checkout date. My hands trembled when I signed the paper. I glanced down at the appointment board behind the desk, just long enough to scan the names. Hers was still listed, still working. Still part of the machine that kept this place humming. The receptionist didn't look up when I hesitated. Maybe she already knew what I wanted to ask. I didn't say anything. I turned and left, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Later that afternoon, I passed by the treatment wing again, not on purpose. At least that's what I told myself. The hallway smelled the same, clean, herbal, just sharp enough to feel clinical. A woman walked out of one of the rooms with the same dazed expression I must have worn 2 nights ago. Her hair was slightly tousled, her lips parted like she had forgotten how to speak. I froze where I stood, pressing my back to the wall. She didn't see me, but I saw enough. I recognized the look, the flush, the way she touched her own arm as if remembering someone else's hands. The next time I went to my room, I couldn't stop looking at my body in the mirror. I examined myself like I was a crime scene. There were no bruises, no scratches, no evidence, just skin that felt too thin and eyes that didn't match the woman I remembered being. I tried to masturbate that night, hoping it would offer relief, clarity, something. But my fingers felt foreign, mechanical. There was no response, only the ghost of her mouth between my legs and the shame that followed. At breakfast the following day, I noticed two women at a table near the window. One whispered something into the other's ear, and they both laughed. I shouldn't have looked, but I did, and I saw her again, my massage therapist, emerge from the hallway, clipboard in hand, expression unchanged. One of the women caught her eye and smiled, slow and soft. She smiled back, not with seduction, with familiarity, like they knew each other in a way that went deeper than touch. My stomach twisted, and I looked away. Something inside me collapsed. I didn't book another appointment. I didn't need to. The message was clear. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen. I was part of a pattern, a rhythm, a service, an offering collected and forgotten, a warm body shaped to hold pleasure and then dismissed. The realization settled into me like a bruise, slow to spread but impossible to ignore. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel betrayed, but all I felt was foolish. I had imagined something singular. She had delivered something routine. Later that evening, I stood outside the treatment room again. I didn't knock. I just stood there, hand hovering near the doorknob, listening to the faint sounds of music and muted footsteps inside. I imagined another woman lying where I had, legs parted under flickering candlelight, her body soft and expectant. I imagined the same hands moving the same way, the same lips offering the same release. My breath hitched, but I didn't cry. I simply turned and walked away, each step slower than the last. Back in my room, I opened the spa-provided journal and stared at the blank page. I thought about writing something, a confession, a warning, a goodbye, but the pen hovered and never touched the paper. What was there to say? That I had been seduced by a stranger in a place designed to blur the lines between care and want? That I had given permission without words and received something I hadn't earned but still craved? There was no language for that, only the feeling of a door closing quietly behind me. For the rest of the retreat, I moved like a shadow. I smiled at the other guests. I nodded at the staff. I drank cucumber water and attended guided breathing classes. No one asked me anything. No one noticed the change. That was the cruelest part. How easy it was to disappear. How easy it was to look untouched while everything inside had shifted beyond repair. I realized then that the intimacy hadn't undone me. The silence afterward had. On my final day, as I packed my things and folded the white robe back into its pristine square, I found a single dark hair caught in the collar. It wasn't mine. I held it between my fingers for a long time before letting it fall into the trash. I zipped my suitcase and closed the door gently behind me. The hallway was quiet. The air smelled like rosemary again. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew I would carry her with me long after I left, not because of what she gave me, but because of what she didn't. The scent of lavender still clung to my skin the morning I left. It had soaked into the fibers of my robe, embedded itself into the lining of my suitcase, and settled like dust in the corners of my senses. Every breath I took carried that same sterile sweetness, laced with the faint, rubbery undertone of latex gloves and oil-soaked sheets. It was no longer comforting. It wasn't even unpleasant. It was just present, like the echo of something that had once been soft, but now simply lingered, uninvited. I moved through the checkout process like I was underwater. The receptionist handed me a mint-scented towel and offered a practiced smile. I returned it without making eye contact. My body was functioning out of routine, not desire. I signed the receipt, nodded at a staff member I didn't recognize, and rolled my suitcase behind me without looking back at the building. The automatic doors opened with a quiet hiss, and the morning air hit me like a slap. Cold, crisp, real. It smelled like damp pavement and pine needles, and for a moment, I almost cried from relief. The drive home was longer than I remembered. I didn't play music. I didn't make any calls. I let the silence press in from all sides. The trees lining the highway blurred past in streaks of green and gray. I felt like a passenger in my own car, like my hands were responding to muscle memory, but my mind was curled up somewhere in the trunk, wrapped in a damp towel. I kept adjusting the air vents, unable to find a temperature that felt right. My skin itched under my sweater. My thighs stuck to the seat in a way that reminded me of other textures, ones I didn't want to name. Back at home, the house greeted me with a stale stillness. No scent of dinner, no sound of movement, just the low hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the living room clock. I dropped my bag by the door and went straight to the laundry room, peeling off my clothes piece by piece as I walked. I shoved everything into the machine, every sock, every bra, even the robe they had insisted I take as a gift. I poured in detergent with shaking hands and started the cycle on hot. I watched the drum spin for a long time, hypnotized by the blur of lavender cotton and dark gray elastic. The hum of the wash filled the space where thought should have been. In the bathroom, I turned on the shower as hot as it would go. I scrubbed my skin until it turned pink, until the steam fogged the mirrors and the tiles beneath my feet felt slick and unfamiliar. I used a different soap than usual, something citrusy and sharp, hoping it would overwrite the scent buried in my pores. But it didn't. When I toweled off, I could still smell her. Not her body, not her perfume, but the oil, the gloves, the polished stillness of her presence. It had embedded itself into me like resin. That night, I opened my suitcase and found the small bottle of massage oil they had given me on the first day. I had forgotten it was there, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, labeled with my name in delicate cursive. I unscrewed the cap and held it to my nose. Lavender, almond, something floral I couldn't place. Underneath it all, the ghost of heat, the kind that didn't burn but smothered. I didn't put the cap back on. I left it open on the nightstand like some quiet threat to myself. Days passed, but the weight didn't lift. I went back to work, cooked dinners, answered emails, responded to texts. I smiled when required, nodded when expected, and kept my answers short. People told me I looked rested, refreshed. Some commented on my skin, said it glowed. I laughed politely and thanked them, but inside, something had shifted out of alignment. I felt like I was walking with one shoulder higher than the other, like my center of gravity had been knocked sideways. I started noticing things in the mirror. Little changes. The way my lips parted when I was alone, the way I reached for lotion more often, the way I touched my own arm absent-mindedly while reading, like I was waiting for something. There were nights I'd lie awake, replaying every second of that last session, not in a fantasy, not out of longing, but like trying to reconstruct a dream before it faded. There were parts I wasn't sure were real. Had she whispered something near my ear? Had I moaned out loud? Had she kissed my hip, or was that just the oil cooling against my skin? I never told anyone, not my sister, not my oldest friend, not the woman I occasionally met for coffee and safe, shallow conversations. It didn't feel like a secret. It felt like something sacred and shameful all at once, like an infection I didn't know how to treat, something I asked for, something I surrendered to, something I walked into with my eyes open and my mouth shut, and now it was mine to carry, quietly,
permanently. Sometimes I think about the other women who must have felt what I felt. I imagine them in their own homes, also haunted by hands that were too skilled, too practiced, too familiar. I wonder if they too stand in their bathrooms late at night, running their fingers along the edges of their hips, remembering. I wonder if they kept the robe, if they opened the oil bottle again, if they swallowed the same mixture of guilt and arousal, loneliness and betrayal, if the scent of lavender now makes them flinch. It's strange how something so soft can feel so violent in hindsight. Her touch hadn't bruised me, but it had marked me, not with fingerprints, but with memory, with the quiet devastation of being chosen and then released like it meant nothing. The truth is, I still don't know if I regret it. What I do know is that every time I catch that scent, every time I pass by my nightstand and see that little bottle, I feel the echo of her. Not her name, not her face, just the imprint and the undeniable, lingering taste of lavender and latex.